Hi, this is Kowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at the role of voting and some of the hindrances that Americans face when going to the polls. So here are our learning objectives here. And in terms of voting behavior, we'll start first, is there are typically four different ways in which you can classify a voter. The first one being the rational choice based on what people are perceiving to be in their own best interest. So for example, if you vote for the politician who's best going to support you economically, you're voting your wallet, that would be the rational choice, or whatever you see as your best interest. Retrospective is based on whether the party or the candidate in power should be reelected based on the recent past. Prospective, thinking in the future how a party or a particular candidate will perform in the future for you. And then you have those party line supporters who are very loyal Republicans or very loyal Democrats, and really you have very little chance of them going to the other aisle. And they're basically going to be a straight ticket voter, meaning every candidate, regardless of who they are, as long as they have an R next to their name or a D next to their name, you will vote for that person. So again, these are the four main political models of voting behavior. Now, over time, it's very important to know that the U.S. has become much more democratic, and that might be an obvious statement, but nevertheless, you see that in our constitutional amendments. For example, the 15th Amendment, allowing blacks to vote. 17th Amendment, allowing the direct election of senators. 19th Amendment, women can vote. 23rd, allowing the District of Columbia to vote in the Electoral College. The 24th, outlawing the use of poll taxes. And then finally, the 26th Amendment, allowing for 18-year-olds to vote. And this has significantly boosted the number of eligible voters. Now, in terms of historic voter suppression, you have things like poll taxes. You would actually have to pay a tax to vote. And then you have literacy tests, where you would have to be able to pass a very complicated test, which would require you to be able to read. And of course, if you were a minority, you probably didn't have the money to spend to vote. You also probably did not have the education background, thus suppressing the potential ability of, for example, blacks to vote. You also had grandfather clauses. Well, what about those white, uneducated people in the South who tried to vote, but they couldn't probably pass a literacy test, or maybe they were too poor? Well, basically this says if your grandfather voted in historically and was able to vote, then you were sort of quote-unquote grandfathered in, so that exempted you oftentimes from paying a poll tax or having to pass a literacy test. You also had white primaries where only whites were allowed to run and to be to vote, and all this is going to sort of be dwarfed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We know that, of course, with poll taxes, that's going to be outlawed through the 24th Amendment, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to be very important because it said not only the federal government, but the state government could not deny any individual the right to vote based on race or color, so literacy tests are going to be made illegal. And it's also going to allow the federal government to use election inspectors in the event that they believe that there's any voter suppression with regards to this. Now, when we talk about modern suppression to voting, what's interesting is you see this coming from more the state level than the federal level. And when I mean the state level, remember, as per the 10th Amendment, each state is going to be able to set up its own rules and procedures for voting. And the big push recently has been voter ID laws. Now, if you're a liberal, you're going to say that these ID laws are trying to decrease voter turnout, and they are aimed at lower socioeconomic groups, and that there is very little or no evidence of voter fraud. And if you look at, according here to the DNC, that the number of people who are being affected who don't have a government-issued ID for one reason or another, these tend to be all, for the most part, with these four categories here, Democratic bases of support. And they're going to argue that Republicans are aiming these voter ID laws here to disenfranchise them from voting. Now, on the other side of the aisle, you're going to have conservatives and Republicans saying, well, for example, you need a driver's license to drive. You need some type of identification to fly. So why don't you need an ID law to vote? So that's what they're going to be the counter argument to that as well. Recently, there have been signature laws. So when you register to vote, your signature has to match it. That's been a new claim of suppression. There's also long lines. There were instances in which in Georgia they were shutting down polling precincts but overwhelmingly those precincts tended to be areas where you had minority populations, with, again, liberals claiming that that was modern suppression. It's also noted that minorities are 6 times more likely than whites to wait an hour to vote. So again, these are some modern, and they put suppression as to whether or not you believe it, to voting. Now, when you look at voter ID laws, when they've been studied, and this is coming from the website 538, when you have ID laws, you see that there is a small percentage of a net swing to the Republican candidate, and we see this most effective here in Pennsylvania, that you're not only decreasing turnout, but in terms of the popular vote, you're shifting more of that to the Republican. And again, that's typically why Democrats and liberals tend to be against voter ID laws. All right, moving on towards voter turnout. When you look at voter turnout, there is sometimes a reason why we don't have as many people compared to European elections. So what really has to happen first is, do you see clear differences between the parties or the candidates, likely to be voting? If you think Republicans and Democrats are both equally bad, well, then it's rational to think that you're not going to vote. You're going to abstain. And you also see decline over time, too, with voter fraud. Back in the day, you did not really have strict voter registration procedures. You had a ton of voter fraud. And as a result, people were voting and getting paid for it, paid for their votes. And as a result of stricter voting registration procedures, that actually is going to decrease the number of people who turn out. Now, what's interesting is registration is done automatically in Europe, whereas in the United States, you actually have to manually register. Now, some states are even taking the initiative that when you sign up for your driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote, but that's only a handful of states so far. Other factors with respect to low voter turnout depends on your political efficacy. Do you believe that your participation in voting is really going to make a difference? Well, it really can. I mean, it may be in most elections at the end of the day it's not, but there have actually been recent instances where even like for the state assembly in Virginia, I believe, you had it being decided by a matter of one vote determined the winner. So yes, every vote certainly does count. And you also have the idea of ballot fatigue, that there are so many offices that people have to vote for, that people actually only vote for the couple of races at the top of the ballot, and they actually skip the rest because they may not know the candidate, or they literally don't have that time, or they are literally fatigued. Whereas some people see it as a good civic duty, that it is your basically your duty, your obligation to support the democratic government, and that a citizen should always vote no matter what the office may be. Now, if you don't have a strong sense of civic duty, well then that's probably going to contribute to the lower voter turnout. Other reasons why people don't vote: you have to register, as we said before. Other states, again, do have same-day registration, but the bulk do not. There's a ton of apathy out there where they think that their vote is not going to be making a difference, or they just don't care. You have seen an extension of suffrage, the right to vote, that has helped to some extent, but we know that it's not enough, as much of the registered voting population still does not vote. It also depends on whether it's a midterm or a presidential election. If it's a midterm election where you don't have a president running, that has much lower voter turnout as opposed to who's running for the president. Some people also believe that political parties are very ineffective today, especially, so they're not going to be voting in that way. If it's dealing with the Electoral College and you're having a president run, they believe that, hey, my vote doesn't matter if I'm a Republican in a very blue state like California, or vice versa. I'm a Democrat in Arkansas. My vote isn't going to matter. So those are, again, some of the contributing reasons as to why people do not vote. And then when you look at some of these charts when they poll people, it might be it's too busy. Well, yeah, you might be working multiple jobs on a Tuesday where you don't have off. You might be ill. You might not be interested. You might hate the candidates. You are out of town. You don't know why you didn't vote, but you just didn't. Registration problems. That certainly has been one that's been increasing, whether it's because of signature laws, whether it's because you don't have an ID that's government issued. Inconvenient polling place. Is it inconvenient to drive 3, 4, 5 miles or farther? Maybe. You forgot. That might be a thing if you don't listen to the news or anything. Transportation problem, absolutely. Or bad weather. Actually, bad weather does actually dwarf the vote, surprisingly. If it's raining or there's a snowstorm, less likely to have voter turnout. No surprise there. Now, when we talk about voter registration, that of course basically mandates that you have to register first before voting. Every state is different. It's important to keep in mind that even though 2/3 of the voting population is registered, that does not mean that we have all that voting population coming out. Now, it's going to depend. Your party strength, how loyal are you to the political party and the candidate? Does that state have automatic registration? Does your country have compulsory voting laws, such as in Australia? Those are typically some of the reasons why you have voter turnout much higher in other countries compared to the United States. So in one push at the national level to get more people registered was the Motor Voter Act, otherwise known as the National Registration Act of 1993, which requires states to permit people to register to vote when they apply for their driver's licenses. So you have an initial surge, but the issue is just because you're registering people doesn't mean that they're going to be coming out on election day, and this has had mixed results. So states typically, though, with election day registration tend to have much higher turnout. That is definitely true. So whether or not the Motor Voter Act is really effective, there's really mixed evidence on that regard. But as I said before, with the difference between midterm and presidential election turnout rates, you see presidential election rates are always going to be higher than your midterm elections, because people typically are going to be regarding the presidential election to be much more important. So, who votes? Well, it is very clear that the more education you have, the more partisan you are, the more loyal you are to a political party, the older you are, you're much more likely to vote. Whites are more likely to vote, but when you factor in other ethnicities with similar education, they have the similar voting rate. Gender, females are much more likely to vote. People who are married are much more likely to vote. If you belong to a union, you're much more likely to vote. So these are some of the major ones. So the more traits that you have here, they are cumulative, the more likely you are to be voting. And again, you see some of these social groups here by turnout in 2004. So you see that the youngest people actually have the lowest amount. And again, no surprise, there are lowest education, lowest turnout. Again, whites having the highest turnout, women slightly out-edging men, married versus single. Government workers absolutely are going to come out much more because, again, their way of life might be impacted based on who is in office. So ultimately, there are other factors affecting voting, and it comes down to some of these characteristics. Personality. We've seen an increase in candidate-centered campaigns, so it's not so much that you're tied to the political party as much as you are tied to a person's personality. Do they seem affable? Do they seem like you could shake their hand and have a discussion with them? People are tending to vote more on personality. Also character. Can you trust this person? Does this person have integrity? Is there a lot of scandalous issues going on? But ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important political issue is going to be the economy. That's almost always the issue. And there's a famous phrase known as, "It's the economy, stupid," and that certainly rings true in many elections and sure will for future elections to come.